the recent intrigue around Gary's economics.
Welcome to Gary's Economics.
He's betting on the collapse of society.
What the heck is going on down here? I don't know.
But he's also a voice for the struggling.
The super rich who have been living lives of luxury for hundreds and hundreds of years to eat everything while ordinary families couldn't afford to feed their kids.
Is accumulating wealth a moral thing to do or not? There's something that Gary figured out about how to approach life. There's nothing that Gary necessarily inherited he didn't inherit.
Do you not say that his intelligence is genetic?
Because money doesn't solve all your problems, but it does solve all your money problems.
Look, start businesses, be entrepreneurial, create jobs for other people. Not everyone's going to do that, but everyone, if you're not starting a business, is going to work for someone who has started a business.
One of the things he talks a lot about is how a lot of things are like a competitive resource, like how housing is a competitive resource. The argument is true and it's wrong.
There needs to be a stage where you're actually content with what you have and you feel fulfilled through the right things and not just fulfilled through money. It's really difficult to have conversations like this because as soon as you try and make a counterpoint to the person who's standing up for rights of the most impoverished people in the society, you can be very easily labelled as someone that doesn't care about those people. Navigating that conversation is going to be difficult.
Welcome back to Metaphysical Graffiti. It's been a while since we've sat down and recorded. This is a new setting for us. I think this is quite a nice, consistent place for us to record, so hopefully the quality's better. We've been having a lot of chats back and forth recently about the recent intrigue around Gary's economics. If you've been anywhere in London in particular, you will have seen his book has been advertised all over the tube. His content is being pushed out a lot on YouTube. And basically want to discuss a lot of the points that he's making, where we agree, where we disagree. I know Sam has been doing a lot of thinking about this in particular. So with that, I'd love to hear a bit more about how you found out about Gary, what do you think his best arguments are, what do you think his worst arguments are, and we'll take it from there, really.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons why I'm also really interested in him is because I'm not in I don't work in the finance industry. So maybe how I interpret a lot of what he's saying is going to be very different to how you do. So obviously you've got a background in finance industry, you're still working there, so it'll be interesting to see your perspective on this as well. How I was introduced to him is basically through this YouTube video where they did an overview of what banking or what the trading floors were like back in the early 2000s before the financial crash, and how basically the regulation of banking has changed since the financial crash, and it basically meant that the culture of the banking system also has changed massively. So I was really interested in what that culture was like pre-2008. He was also talking about how he started as a trader for Citibank, and he was the most successful trader that Citibank had, I think, for a good few years. And yeah, and then he talks about how the reason what made him successful was basically betting the collapse of the UK economy. I wouldn't say he's charismatic, but he was certainly, like, the way he spoke was very captivating, and he's spoken a lot about all the successes and all the bets that he's made against the UK economy, and how and I'm quoting him when he says that he's betting on the collapse of society. And I always find that really interesting when he says things like that, because he's very open about it, and like, who's open about betting against, the downfall of the UK? And he seems to have done a complete 180 in terms of what he must have been thinking when he was in his early 20s in the 2000s of, okay, I'm going to bet against the collapse of the UK economy, to now where he's almost taken the stance of someone who's still a working class lad that's in East London, that's completely removed from that banking, that financial world, and all they can think of is what bills they've got to pay and whether or not they can turn the heating on at winter, or whether or not they've got enough food to feed their family. That's the stance he's taken now. He's claiming to be a voice for those people. So I find that really interesting, that juxtaposition between the sort of the life that he's had and how he's worth millions, and he's probably got millions in assets, but he's also a voice for the struggling human being in the UK that is constantly living in poverty and unsure whether or not their next paycheck is going to cover their bills and their outgoings. And so yeah, I find that really interesting. keen to know what your perspective is, or how did you come to find Gary's economics, and what's your perspective on him, just as an entity, before we get into really what he says.
Yeah, I mean, I started to notice his book being advertised very heavily, The Trading Game.
Yeah.
I mean, full disclosure, I've not read the book.
Yeah.
I think the book is more about his story than it is necessarily about a lot of the stuff he talks on his YouTube channel.
Okay.
I'm sure he talks about some of that stuff in his book, but I've watched quite a few of his videos on YouTube, and I find the presentation of it very interesting. Like, I think it's like great. It's like a guy sitting at his kitchen table, and it kind of comes across as very like from the heart, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
He always dresses down, like he's always just presenting himself as like kind of man-to-man discussion.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
There's no like frills about it. And he's kind of like, one thing is he is communicating economic subjects in a way that people are resonating with.
Yeah.
Whether or not we agree with his conclusions are kind of a separate point. Like, the point is that he's making, at least in some sense, some economic thinking in such a format that is accessible and kind of like consumable to a lot of people. And so I think the back of his success of him having a unique story, people love the story of a guy in a way that's kind of bootstrapped himself to being a multimillionaire. So that's kind of how I found out about him. You know, just like one of those things, you start to become aware of something. There's a bit of adverts that are creeping in, and then once you notice something, you tend to notice it more often.
Yeah.
And then you start getting recommend some of his videos, and then actually click on them because, oh, I've seen this guy.
Yeah.
And that's kind of how I've come to know about him. The way I would describe, just moving on to a little bit, I think some of his thinking. I mean, firstly, he's clearly, nobody makes millions of pounds in trading by accident, right? Like, and the market is ruthlessly efficient.
Yeah.
So you have to be good.
Yeah.
Like, he's clearly a very intelligent guy to be able to make the kind of bets that are paid off to that scale. It's not easy.
Well, that's what he said. He said he was naturally talented at maths. That he'd win all the maths competitions that he entered at school. Yeah. And that he went to London School of Economics, which is a very prestigious university in the UK. And then cheated his way in at this trading game, basically, which he's openly admitted. But I think, and he also he uses that story as well as another way to sort of highlight his intelligence. That he can think outside the box. That he's not. You can't really categorize him as you can't really label him as a sort of typical banker or trader. That he's basically figured out a way to game the system, and I think that's his brand as well. So that trading game is a good way of sort of describing him as a person, that he's even cheated the bankers that were assessing who they should let into their company. That's his sort of first step, is like that's the first thing that he did to stick two fingers up at the system, was that I'm just going to cheat the game, basically
get in basically back door. Yeah. And so I mean, first off, like, you know, to even get into that position, it's a prestigious bank, Citibank. Like, it's not easy to do that, regardless of how you get there.
No.
Scratch and claw. And then you also have to prove yourself every day.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, if you know people who work in kind of hedge funds or kind of as traders, it is insanely Darwinian, right? They're constant. You're expensive, and you're only as good as your last year's take, basically. It's kind of like sales in a way, where it's like, doesn't matter how much people like you, like, if you're not bringing the bottom dollar, you're gone, you know?
Yeah, exactly. And also the opposite end of that, whereas if you're making the bank so much money and you want to leave, they won't let you leave, because there'll be something that you've done that has, like, maybe breached some regulation or whatever, and the bank knows exactly what you're doing, but they won't say anything because you're making the bank money. But as soon as you want to leave, then it comes out and they say, look, if you leave, we can bankrupt you, because we can take you to court and you're basically not going to have a life. And he says that, and he said that's what he was told when he wanted to leave, which is fascinating as well. I mean, I can't imagine what it must be like to be like mid-20s, worth, 5-10 million. Yeah. Crazy.
Yeah. So actually, a lot of respect for the guy, right? Yeah. Like, especially like to have the frame of mind to look at your situation and be like, I want to, not let this define me. I want to define myself.
Yeah.
I think, huge amount of respect.
Completely agree. Like, respect for anyone that's able to sort of, especially with his background, to come out of like a very poverty-stricken area and to basically become a self-made man. And I think it's also worth saying that we also have respect for his economic stance as well, which is trying to be that voice for the really impoverished working class man or women, or like basically those families that do struggle to pay their bills and that do struggle to basically forecast the year, like, okay, I'm going to have enough money to have the heating on when it comes winter, and have enough money to basically take my kids on like a nice trip on holiday. Or there are families that exist in the UK that struggle basically financially a lot, and he's been the voice for them, which is good. And they do need a voice, and they do need someone to fight their corner. And we're not disagreeing that those people don't exist.
Ultimately, what we're saying is we actually also really empathize with that, but we disagree about the approach that he takes. Right?
Yeah, I think I disagree with the approach. And I think, and we can get into like this meta topic about having conversations like this, because it's really difficult to have conversations like this, because as soon as you sort of try and make a counterpoint to the person who's standing up for rights of the most impoverished people in the society, you can be very easily labeled as someone that doesn't care about those people.
Yeah.
So navigating that conversation is going to be a difficult thing to do. Obviously, we're trying to have that conversation here. So I think it's necessary that we make these caveats, before we get into it.
Yeah. And I think, we obviously just bring our perspective to it as well, right?
Yeah.
Like we have a different view to what I imagine someone who grew up in the East End of London would have, right?
Yeah, completely. I mean, we've got very, our perspective on the world is shaped by the people around us. And to some degrees, like, we're sheltered from a lot of like what the average UK person experiences. It's funny because, like, from when I look at my own life, I feel like I am the average UK citizen. But then someone else that's grown up, in a completely different town to me, they'll think that what they're experiencing is the average.
Yeah.
And so I think it's really difficult to actually have a really broad and broad view of like actually what the average UK citizen experiences, because all of the people that you're going to meet are going to be people that are so similar to you. And how often do you bump into people in London that actually just weirdly have some connection with some mutual friends that you've had in a different city in somewhere else in the world? It's like your position in society and like whatever class you are, you just meet people in that class.
Yeah,
it's really hard, especially in the UK where it's like a class-based society, where people from a certain class go to the same coffee shops. They take the same tube lines at the same time of day. You know what I mean? And the people that are working class maybe are more likely to take lines on or take the tube at certain times of the day, like maybe really early in the morning. So they're more likely to bump into people in their social class as well.
Not even take the tube at all,
or not even take the buses. So they're more likely to meet people in their sort of class because they're all taking the buses as well.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So it's the infrastructure of the UK, or I guess in any society, is set up in a way that, like, whatever your place is in society, that you're just going to meet more people that are at your sort of class level.
And actually, this is not a bad opportunity to advance a theory I've been working on since university. That's what I thought. I haven't it's like a codified theory.
Yeah.
But, like, I was looking at because obviously we've lived through now like an insanely like active time, like politically speaking. And I think it's really interesting how different cultures view different issues. And I think the US in particular views a lot of things through a race-based lens, because a lot of their history, including their civil war, all these kind of things, have predominantly been topics centered around race. So they fought a civil war to free slaves in a sense. And some people say, it's for states' rights. But it's like, well, state rights to do what? Is to keep slaves. So ultimately, it was like a war about slavery. And so if you have this like society-wide cataclysm centered on race, obviously race becomes this like kind of charged issue. Look at the civil rights movement in the 60s and so on. And so my broad like conception of the US is that a lot of like political topics will end up having a race-based lens that they look through. It's like, okay, how does this affect people of different races and creeds or whatever?
Okay.
In the UK, I think it's much more a class-based lens that people look at topics through. I'm not saying that there's no class-based issues in the US and there's no race-based issues in the UK. I'm just saying, in general, the lens through which people address or kind of view topics through is much more class-based in the UK. And I think a fantastic example of this is the difference between Obama and Rishi Sunak. I think a lot more was made of the fact that Obama was the first black president of the US than was made of the fact that Rishi Sunak was the first British version of the word Asian, Prime Minister of the UK. And I think it was much more in a sense, like kind of relevant that Rishi Sunak had gone to Winchester and Oxford than it was that he was an Asian man.
Yeah.
Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, I think the system itself kind of like, those are kind of more the steps that one should like gone through basically.
Yeah,
to
exactly.
end up to be prime minister.
Yeah.
If you see what I mean.
Yeah, completely. Yeah, I know what you mean. So it doesn't really matter what color of skin you have or what your cultural background is. What matters is like, have you gone through these institutions that are set up to make you prime minister?
To make you the class that would, you know, and that's what a lot of the attacks against Jeremy Corbyn were like. What he went to like London Met, he got E's at A level, like he didn't like kind of go through these kind of cultural like proxies that we have, and so I think, and obviously the history of the UK is one of aristocracy, royalty. We still have aristocracy today, although kind of in a very like pared back way, but it kind of exists still. Like, but so I think, you know, people in the UK used to be much more of their class.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? There's and I think there's a degree to which these lines blur a little bit more with the internet and a few things, which we can touch on. But it used to be like, I identify very much with the label that I am an aristocrat, or like Churchill's a great example. He just like acted like a Victorian through 19th, like a Victorian aristocrat, or like it's kind of like I am working class, you know, and you know you identify with that label quite strongly in a way. I think that is part of the broader context of how we view these political issues in the UK.
It's interesting the evolution of those class labels and how much someone is willing to openly admit what class they're from, because over time you can continue to be proud of your working class backgrounds, but you can't be proud of your aristocratic background anymore.
I would say. Tell me a bit about like how you identify. Like, what did you think like when you were growing up? Like, did you identify like working class, middle class? Like, how did you?
I think for me, it's really, in my particular situation, quite interesting, because I think I definitely had a middle class household, but I guess working class roots. My dad grew up in a working class family, and me and my siblings used to joke about that when my dad bought our first house in Livingston. We just had plastic chairs, plastic tables. Like, we didn't really have any much furniture because my dad was still sort of building on his career as well. And my mum didn't even speak English that well when I was born, and she was still learning English, and she didn't have a job until I guess my youngest sibling had been born, and I was probably around 8, maybe about 10, 12 before my mum started actually working. So it was just my dad supporting 4 kids by himself up until I'm 12. And so it was working class in the sense that it was, and also in the sense of the school and the high school that I went to, a lot of working class kids went to those schools as well. So if you're to take into account the people I interacted with and the sort of lifestyle that my family had, you could say it was kind of working class, but it is middle class in the sense that the values that my dad had were kind of middle class values. So my dad was very good with his money. He was very financially literate. He read books on like how to invest your money, and he taught me about pensions and stuff at a very early age that working class people aren't taught. But middle class people are taught how to do that. And my dad also he put a massive emphasis on education as well. And he said, you want to get good grades in high school so that you can get into a good university, and university is going to open up all these doors for you. So it was working class in some aspects, but middle class, I think, in the sense that he wanted us to have a middle class lifestyle. He wanted us to aspire to accumulate wealth, and the reason why he wanted us to do that was because he wanted his family to be, sorted, so that if anything, God forbid, happened to us, that we would have money to fix those problems. And I think he understood that money fixed problems. And anyway, he basically instantiated a really good framework for us growing up. And I think that's the difference between a working class family and a middle class family, is that I think middle class families and above have frameworks, or I guess ways of living, that they're able to communicate to their children, and those children can adopt those behaviors, and they can and they can sort of go through life with these sort of good life lessons. And whereas a working class family, I don't think that they necessarily have they don't have those lessons basically to take. They don't have like a figure in their family to give them those lessons, I think. And maybe it's I don't really, you're kind of getting into like a controversial topic when you discuss like what's the difference, because my family could have easily been a working class family. Like it could have easily been so working class, but it was just because of a decision that my dad said, a decision that my dad made, which was to say, actually, I want my kids to be successful, and so I'm going to invest a lot of time in growing my career and sacrificing a lot of time with my kids in order to work more, and take jobs where I had to travel more and all of that. So it's, I don't know, for me, I could have easily been like that, but I wasn't. My dad decided to go another direction, and
that's the environment he grew up in, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting to me to think how I could have easily been working class, but I also think that it's also a genetic thing to some degree. I think that if you was a really successful businessman who had a knack for generating wealth and generating money, and he suddenly lost it all, he's got the life experience and the skills and the drive to accumulate that wealth again. And let's just say he has kids and there's all that wealth in the family. I think often we obviously like know that it's really hard to hold on to wealth as and to keep that wealth in the family. But those kids, I think, have whatever it is that made the original sort of like head of the family accumulate all that wealth. There's something in that's in the kids as well that's going to allow them to be sort of entrepreneurial. Do you know?
I would disagree that it's genetic, to be honest. I think it's, I mean, obviously everything is some percentage genetic and some percent, nothing is 100% heritable, 100% environment.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's overly genetic. Like, I think it's predominantly mindset, I would say. Predominantly, I think an interesting, I just think like, if you're the son of or daughter of an insanely successful person who, because of some set of facts that they've figured out about the world, have used those set of facts to cause themselves to become very wealthy in conjunction with a bit of luck. There are some generalizable lessons that you can transmit to your kids.
Yeah.
That they can apply in their respective situations.
Yeah.
I think the biggest thing is also like motivation. You see so many like really, it's like from shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves with 3 generations, right? It's a meme, right? It's like, born with nothing. So you have like the drive and the hustle. Your kids, you kind of take that second generation of kids with you. They're still kids while you're still building up. But those grandkids that grew up in like a super wealthy family have a very different association with money because it's like taken for granted. A great example is a bit off topic is Genghis Khan. The first generation of Genghis Khan's kids took over his massive like global empire and ran it completely successessly. By third, fourth generation, they're having squabbles, having spats.
Yeah.
Genghis Khan and his kids grew up like wearing coats made of like mice they shot. Yeah. Because there's no like sheep or anything on the steppe, And so they grew up with that kind of like grit and that hustle. But then by the time you got to the grandkids, great grandkids, they've grown up in silk robes, the finest of everything China and Europe has to offer. And so the mentality is very different. Yeah. I actually think it's much more a mentality thing. And because the other thing is like when you concede that it's a mentality thing as well, what that gives you is really powerful. What it gives you is that it's something that can be learned and so it can be taught. There's nothing necessarily special about certain people that they can be very successful. There are certain sets of things, right? The drive, the ambition, maybe some confluence of like personality and intelligence. Yeah. But like, you don't have to necessarily be insanely intelligent to be super successful, right? It's also like context and domain specific, right? Yeah. This is a point you make all the time, right? It's like, and the way I think about it is also like playing the hand you're dealt as best you can is your moral responsibility as a person, right? Like it's your responsibility as a person to play whatever cards you're given, whatever ups, whatever downs. Some people massive amount of ups, some people massive amount of downs, and you should play those cards you're dealt in the best way possible. And I think one of the things that I personally, maybe I get through a little bit with Gary, but not necessarily, is like, what is like the relationship to wealth? Like, is accumulating wealth a moral thing to do or not? I think this is one of the first things that you have to, because if you have to change basically. Because if you fundamentally think accumulating wealth is an immoral thing to do, you're never going to take the steps that will cause you to accumulate wealth.
Well,
right?
I think it is a moral question, because you can just rephrase accumulate wealth. You can just rephrase that as investing with a long-term mindset.
Yeah.
And I think having that long-term mindset is the moral thing to do. I think having a short-term view of things.
There are definitely immoral ways to accumulate wealth.
Is immoral. Yeah, there are completely. But I think that the issue is that there are people that exist that can't afford to have a long-term view. They have to adopt a short-term view. But I think the difference in what we're trying to say is, for people that can afford to take a long-term view, that adopt short-term strategies, that's the moral thing. We're not saying that people who are not able to adopt, who aren't able to accumulate wealth are immoral because they're not doing it.
Well, a huge amount of people are not enfranchised enough at all to even be able to take a long-term view. Let's say you're someone who has to work with their hands, and like a physical labor type job. That's where all the skills you've accumulated are, and you have some injury in your workplace, and that kind of cuts you back to only getting like the minimum amount of like cash that the welfare system rightly gives a person like that, because that's kind of what it's there for. That person, like that amount of money is about enough. Probably not even like to just like survive. Just to pay your bills. And how can you possibly from there say, I'm going to save some of my money, I'm going to put some of my money in the stock market? Or I don't even know how or what to do, because it's a scary thing, investing. It's risky. It's like this and that.
What's that thing that Jordan Peterson and Richard Dawkins agreed on at the end of their debate? It was this
Baldwinization.
Baldwin effect, exactly. I think when I was talking about genetics, this is what I had in my head, was the Baldwin effect. It was basically practices that had happened over generations of generations about how you accumulate wealth that is transformed from the physical learning of it into a gene. Exactly. So like the meme would basically be the lessons that your dad tells you, basically like, do this when you've got wealth, like do this, invest it in that, like give it to people. Trust me, son, it's going to come back to you in abundance and all that sort of stuff. But through like hundreds of generations of doing that, I think it becomes ingrained in the gene, where you've got kids who are descendants of people who have been so good at investing and basically optimizing the resources, that when they're dealt a hand, they just naturally know what to do with it. And I think I think when I was on the genetics, that's what I had in mind.
I don't think there should be any kind of structural lock-in that privileges one set of people over the other. What I want to live in is a type of society where people can be rich, but there can also be a massive turnover in who the rich people are. Like you should be really like hyper vulnerable to making bad decisions, and those bad decisions, or anti-social decisions that don't benefit society, causing you to lose the wealth that you've accumulated. There shouldn't be any kind of institutional lock-in because of like regulations or tax policy.
I think I agree with that in theory, but even when you look at the top percentile of people that are constantly turning over, it's just those people that are constantly turning over. It's not like the conveyor belt is like that big, where it's like people from the bottom.
In the US, it's much more like that. Like the amount of millionaires is constant, slightly growing, but the turnover of millionaires is quite high.
But what I'm saying is like, it's not including like the people that are like at the bottom.
Not including them.
I don't think really.
I mean, I don't have like specific data, but it's just something I remember like understanding by reading.
Well, I guess certainly not in the UK.
My point is, it should be like this degree of meritocracy. Like if you have a wealthy family that hands their wealth to a generation that doesn't care, that doesn't do anything, doesn't invest, doesn't like build things for other people, doesn't build factories for people to work in, that doesn't like, then the system should be such that they can lose the wealth they've accumulated. You know what I mean?
I agree
poor
with
decisions,
that.
poor investments, poor like
I agree with that, and
because
that's
they don't
what's happening.
meritocratically deserve it, basically.
Yeah, and that's actually kind of what's happening with like the aristocrats that like exist today that don't really know what to do with their wealth and their assets. Like it just deteriorates. I just remember this program of like this aristocratic family that has this that owns this like huge castle on like loads of land, and they're quite a laughable family because they're completely out of touch with the average person in society, and they but the castle's like crumbling around them. They just don't know what to do with it, and they come across as like very, very stupid and ignorant, and but like that's like a good example of what you've just said about aristocratic families that aren't actually reinvesting their wealth back into the economy, and thereby generating more wealth. They're just losing it. And but I'd say that's an example where the meme hasn't gone into the gene. So this family, once it loses all its wealth, will probably go back into a middle class household, and their kids probably won't have learned the right ways of like accumulating
But
wealth again.
the point is, if it was genetic,
Yeah,
they would just intuit what to do. My point is that it's like what kind of culture does your family set up?
yeah,
You know what I mean? Like those kids probably grew up in a situation where they never had to really think about how do I make money? How do I,
yeah,
because everything's taken care of for them. You know what I mean? Like I also think it's like an agency point, right? Like
yeah.
how much agency are you required to have at any given stage of your life?
Hmm.
And if you're constantly having things done for you, then, you know, you're never going to have that kind of drive and will to be like, I'm going to go do it for myself,
Yeah.
you know, because someone will take care of that. You know what I mean?
Do you not think though that like the kids of this aristocratic family that are losing all their wealth, if they're put in a situation where what's that film called that is about this, basically a rich family that loses all their money and they have to live like middle class or like
Oh, the shits.
yeah, I think
The
it's
Netflix
something
show.
like that.
Yeah.
It's like they know what it's like, and they will find living like a normal person completely intolerable. So they will find ways of actually going back or trying to get back what they lost. Do you not think that
Mm.
that's part of what would drive them to then accumulate wealth?
No, I just think there's a certain like set of ideas that anyone can learn
Yeah,
that if they act out those set of ideas, they're massively increasing the amount of universes in the future in which they become wealthy. So if you think about it like as a probability game, right? Like if I act out all this set of things, it's not a guarantee that I'll become wealthy,
hmm,
but I'm massively increasing the likelihood that that will happen in the
hmm,
future, right? And especially in a case where someone has done it before,
hmm.
they know what worked, right? So they can act out those certain things again. And that's a generalizable culture that you can transmit to your kids.
Yeah,
And there's something about like the set of things you had to go through, right? Like if you like are born into a family that let's take Gary's economics, right?
hmm,
Like where you're born like in an East End family, there's poverty all around you. There's something that Gary figured out about how to approach life that's different to some of the people around him that led him to take a set of decisions that caused him to end up in a position where he's super wealthy, right?
hmm.
And he can teach some of those lessons to his kids. There's nothing that Gary necessarily inherited or didn't inherit. He's dealt a set of cards. One of those cards is I'm good at maths. Another card is I am like willing to work like disgusting hours.
Would you not say that his intelligence is genetic?
It's definitely like heritable, but not like completely heritable. So there's probably some snowball effect as well with the maths, right? Where he showed some early prowess, so he's put in like a higher like class,
Hmm.
and then that was kind of a positive reinforcement loop.
Yeah.
Like it's like purely
Hmm.
heritable. There's like also like a massive interaction with the environment, you know.
Is it how much of it can it be environment? Because there's millions of people that have gone through the exact same
Hmm.
school experience, working class experience that Gary's economics.
I guess the question
gone
you're asking
through.
is like, how did he do it when other people around him couldn't? That's kind of what you're asking, right?
Yeah, and he's the exception to the rule.
Hmm.
And this is why I think it is definitely much more of a genetic thing than it is an environmental thing. Because
Wouldn't that be an argument for massive redistribution? Because it's just luck of the draw who just so happens to be genetically
well,
predisposed
I
to
wouldn't say it's lucky because and the reason why I'm not saying it's lucky is because of that Baldwin effect. Because that's not luck.
But I think you're overestimating the speed at which the Baldwin effect would take, because that obviously wouldn't have been the case for.
Well, I think I'm not talking about like the Baldwin effect, exactly. What I'm saying is, like, it's still very much in that meme phase before it's got to the gene, right? So, for example, like the lessons that my dad taught me.
Yeah,
It's like,
those are
I
memes.
had to have a certain level of intelligence to sort of understand what my dad is telling me, right? And which I think is genetic. So you sort of like starting off on this level, and then you have to have the sort of predisposition to actually integrate the meme in your behavior.
To care.
Yeah.
But
And I think that Gary had the predisposition for like the sort of meme to be installed on him, and he'd seen the meme from maybe, I mean, it's early 2000s. Like, there's definitely, he was probably, he says that he could see Canary Wharf from his house, growing up. You know what I mean? Like, that definitely had an effect on like what he was
what does
going
that
to
to
do.
the genes though?
Well, like the level, for him to look at Canary Wharf and think, oh, like that's something to aspire to, I think is a genetic thing, because think about all the other kids that lived near that area that didn't have those sort of like connections going through their head, and didn't have that aspiration.
Okay, so I mean, I think,
and maybe they did have the aspiration, but they weren't even able to have the meme downloaded onto them. So I think, like, if we're talking about memes and like we're talking about like the lessons that my dad gave me in order to build a life, I suppose I had to have a certain software on me so that the correct memes or the memes that my dad was giving me were able to be like downloaded within me and then acted out. I think Gary had the right software, and he just
do you mean hardware if it's saying genetic?
Okay. Yeah.
I would confuse your analogy. Look, I don't think it's very productive to make this a conversation about genes versus memes, to be honest. Because my question is, how with the set, like, 'cause I'm a pragmatist above anything else.
Yeah.
Like, and my way of thinking is always, okay, these are the cards that we have right now as a society.
Yeah.
How can we, like, how do we play these things as best we can?
Yeah.
And I don't think there's anything like inherent about people that they can't learn these lessons. Whether they take those lessons and use them is up to them. But I don't think there's anything inherent about human beings in general that they can't download these memes, this understanding of what are the set of behaviors that I can do to make me more likely to be successful in the long run. My vision of an ideal society is one where it's not my question I ask myself is, and I've put this to you, is like, how hard should it be for the median individual to become very successful and like do well in material terms in society? Because money doesn't solve all your problems, but it does solve all your money problems, right? And it's a better position for the country to be in if the median individual has maybe £10,000 in savings, has the capacity to kind of look after themselves a little bit if things go wrong, if they lose their job. We want people to be in a situation where they're enfranchised enough, and they have that mindset of kind of building, like the Swiss, for example, or the Singaporeans are great examples of this, where like, there's like the culture is one that kind of encourages the types of financial behaviors that means that you actually, I'm not saying get rid of the safety net, I'm just saying it's not as needed because people have the average person is just more wealthy. And I personally want to live in a society where the median person can accumulate a sufficient, like, healthy amount of wealth where they can be self-sufficient. They can like not have to worry about like next paycheck to paycheck. Part of the problem in the UK is salaries are insanely low compared to like peer countries. Our salaries are really bad. We are too penalizing on tax too early. The ISA thing I think works really well because it means that if you have, again, like the financial understanding to open an ISA and use it, that could be like a great way to kind of like tax-free compound some wealth.
Yeah.
But I guess my overall point is that, like, I don't think the genetic argument, firstly, I disagree with it. But secondly, I think it's not helpful. Like, it's not like pragmatic because in a way, what you're saying is there's just a set of people that we can't ever help, if you know what I mean. Because that's the
but I think that's actually, if we want to have a proper practical solution, then that's what we have to acknowledge. I think I disagree with not acknowledging that. And it's like the same point that Jordan Peterson makes, where he's talking about people that have IQs of like 80 or something, and they're 20% of the population. And he's talking about the US here, but he basically says that the US Army has a minimum threshold of what IQ you need to have in order for them to be able to like place you in the correct role in the army. And they basically say anyone with an IQ below 80 or something cannot get into the US Army, and that's 20% of the population. And if you can't get into the US Army, then you're basically, the US Army is a good example of this, because they're never going to turn people away if they can
Get away with
if they can get rid of it, because they want people to join the army as much as possible, especially nowadays where more like less and less people every year are joining the military. So he's basically saying there's 20% of people in society that actually don't like that aren't able to actually join the workforce. They're not even able to do anything. So what are we supposed to do with that 20%?
It's illegal to induct anyone into the U.S. Army if they have an IQ of less than 83, right? It's about 10% of the population. Because the U.S. Army, and they've been doing IQ testing since IQ testing began, because they want everybody they can possibly get into the Army. And so you're not going to be any pickier than you have to be. So when the U.S. Army says it's illegal to induct anybody into the armed forces if they have an IQ of less than 83, then you know that they've done it for absolute necessity. Right? And when people have made a finding that contradicts what they want to hear, and they're doing it out of absolute necessity, you can be reasonably true that it's one of those facts that just won't bloody well go away. And so you might think, well, if there's nothing for someone with an IQ of less than 83 to do in the Army, what makes you think that there's something that they can do in the general population? Well, so this is a discussion that no one wants to have, but that's okay. It's still a problem, and it has to be dealt with.
We need to acknowledge that fact that there are people out there that are just never going to be able to have a grasp of wealth, asset, and wealth / asset accumulation that other people are going to be able to do. And you have to acknowledge that there. And where do those people live? Those people are not living in the most luxurious classes of society. Those people live in the working classes. That's where they are. And so, and this is why I think it's so important to bring up this genetic aspect, because I think that's genetics that determine that. Because there is.
My point is, despite any of that,
Yeah,
you shouldn't have to become like Six Sigma tech entrepreneur
yeah,
to be able to accumulate like a decent amount of
I
wealth.
completely agree.
My point is that it should be like, there should be systems in place in society that are clear kind of like checkpoints that like are kind of assisting people, that help them, even if like you fuck up. It's still like, it's basically, it's harder not to do it than it is to do it.
Yeah.
Right now, I think we're in a position as a society where it's so hard that only the most agentic, only the most like determined people with like the right set of like desires and skills can possibly kind of buy a house, or like, you know, people are willing to move to the bigger cities, and people who like did this and that, you know. And I think that is a toxic position for a society to be in.
Yeah, I agree. But I think that how you solve the problem, or one solution to solving it, would basically be, look, separate people into two buckets. Those people that aren't able to do it for themselves, okay? Because I think what you're trying to say is like there should be one meme or one sort of like set of lessons that if one was able to adopt these behaviors, then they have basically a way out of poverty, and that whatever those lessons are, they should be generalizable, and that they should be applicable to every single human being, that they're just these behaviors. And what I'm saying is there are a set of people that it doesn't matter what you tell them or what you do, they're just not able to adopt these patterns to actually break out of that. And I'm saying that is determined by their genetics, like for those set of people, because it has to be, if it's not environmental that's going to change them, then there has to be a counterforce.
It can't just be
stopping
purely
them.
genetic of it.
Well, if it wasn't, then there would be lessons that are, you know what I mean?
Like, think about like
if
someone who otherwise would have been successful, but they've just been like, every time they've tried anything, they've just been like kicked and spat on, and you know, and they become like resentful. They like hold on to that.
Well, I'd say by definition, if it's not environmental, then it has to be genetic.
Because there could be things about the environment that cause people to basically say like be set up with like the frame of mind that would not even want to, that, you know, let's say the culture of the place you grew up in is one that despises trying, or despises like making an effort, despises the concept, you know, has a really like weird like psychological relationship to money.
Okay.
And that is the culture of the environment you grow up in.
Yeah.
I don't think there's anything genetic about that environment. I think it's a cultural point.
Mhm.
And you can change that like culture.
Yeah. But with behaviors and with lessons.
Yeah.
And again, this is why it's so important to distinguish the two categories.
But
I'm
just
not
like-
talking about those people.
But just like to knuckle down on those people,
Yeah.
I think the portion of people who are like genetically incapable of
Yeah.
internalizing the set of things
Yeah.
are people you should take care of in society. That's kind of why
Yeah.
you have a redistribution of
Exactly. But I think that people are trying
that
to,
is such a small percentage of people.
it's not actually a small percentage. Jordan Peterson's point is that it's like 20% of people.
I don't think that's right.
But we can definitely like look up, and it'll be good to like put those stats on like on the video that you know what I mean. But I think look,
But again, like
IQ is a bell curve, right?
But I also don't place a huge amount of stock in IQ necessarily being a predictor of.
It is. That's actually accurate. That IQ is one of the best predictors of life success. It absolutely is. It's openness to experience. People that are the most successful have the highest IQs, and that's what sexual selection favors as well.
But I don't think you need, like, my point is,
I agree that you don't need it.
My point is, like, how difficult should it be for someone with an IQ of 100? Like, your society can make it easier or harder, right?
Mm-hmm.
For people at various levels of intelligence, various like levels of ambition, various levels of things to be successful. And there are sets of like incentives you can put in place at every level of society that make it easier or harder. My point is that we should make it as easy as possible.
We should.
For the biggest cohort of people in society to say be worth £1 million.
Yeah.
Like, I want everyone in society to have like £1 million of wealth, basically. And I want the systems that we have to be set up in such a way that just a person just acting out normal behaviors like in life lead to that outcome, right?
I completely agree with you. The issue is that there's such a broad range of people in society that you can say, look, I want the average person to be £10,000 more, be worth £10,000 more than what they're worth today, basically. But when you say that, the exact same, what that means is you want people who are worth £10,000 today to be worth £100,000, because that's just the way that money works, right?
Well, it's relative and absolute differences, right?
Well, it's also exponential as well.
Yeah.
So if you want like someone who's like worth £1,000 to be worth £10,000, then you're also saying that you want someone who's worth £10,000 to be worth £100,000. Because when you input a whole bunch of wealth into society, the vast majority of that wealth goes to the people who already have the most. And that's just like the way an open market works. And so the solution to making the average person more wealthy is going to be a controversial solution, because it's going to make those who already have wealth disproportionately even more wealthy. And this is what the thing that Gary's economics is trying to argue against, is that he's saying I don't think that he acknowledges that fact, which is, if you want to have any solution that's going to bring the average person that's in like poverty, that can't afford to pay their bills, that is struggling to pay for food, if you want to get them out of that situation, the knock-on effect, or what that means, is that you're also going to create a society where the wealthy get even more wealthy, basically, because when the tide comes, all boats rise. And that's the way that for the past 60 years, that's been the only successful method for getting people out of poverty, is actually you create open markets, you create free markets, and you allow societies to start more enterprises, and through these entrepreneurs, they create jobs for other people to go work, and then they're able to sort of escape being in poverty. But obviously the people that start those businesses get disproportionately way more wealthy. But what have they done? They've brought everyone that was at the bottom up with them, and people are complaining, oh well, how has he gotten majority of the wealth? And it's like, well, that's an ancient principle, which is the Matthew principle, which you can never. I don't think that it's productive for society to try and curb against that Matthew principle, because as soon as they do, you end up like the USSR, I think. And And even they had that problem as well, where it was just an even smaller percentage of people that had access to all the resources. So it was even more extreme. So that's why I think this is my issue with Gary, is that he's trying to be the voice of that 20% that I'm claiming. Maybe it's not 20%, but he's trying to stand up for those people who are just in such a shit situation in life that they're never really going to escape that poverty through their own willpower. But how they can escape that poverty is through other people starting enterprises and being way more entrepreneurial. And what they're going to do is raise the tide so that we get to a point where those people are able to be supported by more people being more wealthy and paying more taxes. And that's the way I think that you get everyone out of poverty. It's not focusing on the working class people or the people who are never going to start businesses. You don't focus on them and say, look, you just need to be more entrepreneurial. You need to adopt these sort of life lessons, and you don't focus on you help them through some redistribution schemes, but you need to. I think the generalized rules that we need to give people are: start businesses, be entrepreneurial, create jobs for other people. Not everyone's going to do that, but everyone, if you're not starting a business, is going to work for someone who has started a business. And so you need to encourage that in society. And I think that's why it's worth acknowledging that there are people that are just never going to break out of it through their own willpower. But the way that they will break out of it is because of the efforts of those fewer people in society that are able to have the incentives in order to start an enterprise by themselves.
Okay, let's talk about Gary and kind of lay out his arguments as we see them, and then just structurally, right? So one of the things he talks a lot about is how a lot of things are a competitive resource, like how housing is a competitive resource. He talks about how money is a competitive resource, and I think the argument is true and it's wrong in a way. The argument is true that housing is a competitive resource if you're in a situation like we are now, where you're not building enough housing, because then you have a fixed pie of houses that everyone has to compete for. Mm-hmm. And someone else buying a house is robbing you of your chance to get a house. Okay. If the rate of housing supply is increasing at the same rate at which more people want housing is no longer as competitive a resource, because essentially it's growing. The pie is growing, and it's the same thing in an effect for wealth in general. A lot of his arguments, I think, make sense when you're in a stagnated economy like we're in right now, where there's no growth. And, part of the problem, and this is the biggest fear, is growth stopping, is in order to get ahead, if the pie is not growing, the only way that you can get ahead is by taking from someone else, not from generating it yourself, and in that situation, then it kind of makes sense almost to have an argument where it's this is a competitive resource. Someone else getting it is you not getting it. Yeah. So you need to seize it from them. Yeah. And spread it out amongst other people, if you see what I mean. Yeah. And I worry that because we've had such stagnant growth in the UK, this becomes more and more prevalent of an argument. Yeah. As the economic situation gets worse, it is a more salient point. And in a way, it's true. It's true that if the pie is not growing, the only way to get a slice is to take it from someone else. But if the pie is growing, then you have the capacity to generate it for yourself. Do you know what I mean? But it's a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, because in a way, it's almost impossible to seize wealth from people without destroying the incentive to create that wealth in the first place. And again, my position is I want it to be, the system to be set up in such a way that it's easier, or as easy as possible, for the most amount of people to create as much wealth as possible. Because that benefits the whole of society. That benefits growth. That benefits the people themselves. That benefits, and that kind of moves away from this mindset of the only way for me to get ahead is to capture something from someone else and take it for myself. It's always this thing. It's you when things stop growing, it's you start looking over your neighbor's fence and start thinking, the only way I can gain is to take what he has, as opposed to I'm going to build something up, And I think a big problem with the UK is obviously the growth has stopped, and there's not a really good theory as to why the growth has stopped. But I think a huge part of it is that the way the system is currently
Maybe
contrived,
regulations, government regulations.
it's definitely like a huge multivariate thing, right? It's like really high tax, like really regulated.
Expensive energy.
Energy is insanely
I'd say
expensive.
probably one of the biggest reasons, actually.
Energy is one of the topics I'm most passionate about because we have 5 times the energy cost of the US.
We should definitely talk about energy in another episode.
In another episode, yeah, I've got a lot of thoughts on energy, but like,
I'd love to hear.
Energy costs are way too high. Like all of my like strongestly held opinions are about like, you shouldn't have to be in the top 10% of income to be able to afford a house. A house is by definition something that is not an asset. It should be a commodity.
Yeah.
A house should be something that anyone is enfranchised enough. And I've already talked in this podcast about housing, but like, it's ridiculous, the situation with housing where in London, let's say the average wage growth in London as a country every year is 6%. On average, everyone in the country's wages go up 6% per year.
Okay.
You know what else goes up around 6% per year? Rent. The price of rent. So all the excess productivity, all that promotion that you work really hard to get, all this extra like growth that you've kind of found from yourself is getting parasitized away from you into basically landlord's hands. And I'm not inherently anti-landlord because our policy as a country, our current like system, the way we set it up is basically private landlords. And ultimately it has to make sense for you as a landlord. You can't be losing money renting the property out. But the problem with the landlord situation is that we've made it so that you can make a huge amount of money by doing effectively nothing, by just buying a property, sitting on it. You don't have to make it better. You don't have to like invest in your local community. You don't have to like kind of build up the area around you. You don't even have to be in the country. And so you're completely like kind of disconnected and you can just suck all the excess productivity that society is making. So I don't think we can even start to have a conversation about helping people like become wealthy until you address the property situation.
Okay.
One thing I love from like when I went to Singapore is this idea that like, and again, like, you know, I'm, you know, temperamentally quite libertarian. So this is an interesting, like challenge to my worldview in a way. But like the way the Singaporean government tackles housing is that anyone, when they hit the age, anyone when they get married can apply to basically get a government built house. The state in Singapore is effectively like a property developer with the government attached to it.
Yeah.
Because Singapore is incredibly space constrained. They have to be super thoughtful with how they use the land.
Yeah.
And so when you get married, you end up basically being eligible to put a deposit down for a house that you get in 2 to 3 years.
Yeah.
And when you get that house, you put a deposit down, which most people, they plan their life around building up this deposit because they live with their parents. This is a typical milestone they go through their life. Like, I need to have this like 10, 15% deposit ready or whatever.
Okay. And
they put that money down on the deposit and they get that house in 2 to 3 years. Like, here's the keys.
Yeah.
And then instead of paying a mortgage to a bank, the government takes the monthly costs, basically the interest and the capital repayment from their pension.
Yeah.
So the effect to them for their actual cost of housing every month is 0. So all those increased paychecks they get, all that growth they strive to achieve goes directly into their pocket. And so now let's say you're in this situation where you got a government built house that you are slowly increasing your equity in over time.
Yeah.
It's just the thing that everyone does. Like, you don't have to think too much about it. Like, okay, I'm going to get married and get this house. Like, that's just what you do. You know? And then once you've done that, all the excess productivity that you gain as a society or as an individual, all that extra striving you do goes directly in your pocket. And you can then start to think, okay, how do I invest this? How do I like kind of whatever? You see how that kind of fundamentally changes like the set of incentives that most people do. And at a cultural level, you don't even have to think about it in a way where it's like, this is just what everyone's doing. You know, they're doing this thing. And so I'm not saying I want that policy specifically in the UK, but I'm saying that's an example of the architecture of a type of policy that can just naturally lend people to change their mindset about wealth creation, like, you know, building up. Singapore is a very unequal society, but the wealth of the baseline individual in Singapore is much higher than it is in the UK. And again, it's because of the system of cultural incentives that people set up. You don't have to be that smart to follow a set of incentives, if you know what I mean.
Okay.
You see what I mean?
Yeah.
And you can make those incentives really weak or really strong, depending on how you want to do it.
Yeah.
So that's the angle I'm approaching it from, you know. And then housing doesn't become this competitive resource because you're just guaranteed to get a house if you apply for one. You know what I mean? You have to wait a few years, but they've got their system set up in a competent enough manner that there's no kind of like zero-sum thinking as there is in the UK with housing, because we're not building enough, because we're not making it easy enough for people to access it. Imagine you had that system in the UK where you could say, okay, I'm going to pay for my mortgage out of my pre-tax income. Or you said to all young people in society, the first 250k you earn is going to be tax-free.
Yeah.
However, we're going to say, instead of taking that away as PAYE, we're going to be taking that away and sticking it in an account that you can access when you come time to buy your first house.
That's an idea you had, which I liked.
Yeah. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is like, there's room for like, and the average person in the UK earns what, like 28k. So to get to 250k is what? How many years of working? Like 8 years of working. So working from, up until you're about 30, everyone's going to have like a pot of cash that they can then invest. And it's all tax free, basically. My point is that I'm not saying, I'm not like proposing any specific policy. What I'm just saying is this generalized rule of like, if you want to address some of these problems, you can't have a zero-sum mindset. You can't have a mindset of the only way to get ahead is to take from other people.
Yeah.
And you have to have, and you also have to recognize that the way we've currently contrived our particular set of incentives and political systems is not good at leading to the outcome that causes more people to have more wealth, more like kind of like stability, more like place in society.
Yeah.
There's a whole other argument I can make as well about like, I think another problem we have is that we lean too much into like big business as opposed to small business. Like I think there's a certain like benefit that a highly regulated environment benefits big business over small because they can afford compliance to comply with those.
And they can influence the regulations.
Which always get influenced in their favor to the detriment of smaller business. And then it also means that, your option as someone who's going to work becomes more and more the default to work for a massive business.
I think that's part of the reasons why people are less entrepreneurial, because small business is the same thing as like basically startup.
Yeah. And the funny thing is like we've over time like learned the science of starting a business in much more detail. Like there's essays you can read from like Paul Graham, Y Combinator and stuff that like these are the generalized things that we've seen that have led to a wider probability of your business doing well.
Yeah.
Through like hundreds of iterations basically. And those are things you can read for free on the internet. You know what I mean? So it's funny to me that like we have this situation where like we understand better the science of how to do it.
Yeah.
But because like crushing like strangling regulation and also a mindset, right? Like it's really hard to like capture the mindset of how people were in the past, but like to like start a company to do something, like that's something that like we should praise. And I think another part of the problem in the UK, something that really like deeply frustrates me, is we're so doomerist. Like we're so down on ourselves. Like we're so like when something goes wrong, we're like, I knew it.
Yeah.
We're not like, and it's something with the Americans that Brits don't really understand is a kind of like almost like sickening amount of optimism.
Yeah.
And it's like, to what extent are these like, manifesting our destinies, if you know what I mean? Where it's like, if you're like wildly optimistic and you miss, you're much more likely to go again because you think, oh, like I failed, but like I could learn from it. Like, in the UK, like there's a bit of like a mentality of like, if you start a business and it goes wrong, everyone's gonna be like, I knew it. I told you so. Like that didn't go well. Whereas in the US, we're like, like you tried, like try again, like
exactly.
You'll make it one day. Don't worry about it. I think there's also like a mindset, a big difference in the US. This is something we talked about the other day where it's like, I talked about someone else. In the US, people like get upset when like millionaires get taxed more in a way. And the reason is because they, at some level at the back of their mind, think they're going to be a millionaire one day too. Whereas in the UK, it's the complete opposite, if you know what I mean? Where people don't aspire to that at all either. And I think there's also like this like weird relationship with like money and wealth in the UK, where we're also like we're taught to like play down our successes we're taught to kind of like, and not explicitly, it's implicitly. People are like, oh, I got the promotion, but it's only like a small little thing. You know, people always talk themselves down a little bit. Whereas in the US, like sickeningly the opposite. It's like relentless self-promotion.
Yeah.
I'm not saying the Brits will ever do that, right?
Yeah.
Like it's because it's not culturally like going to make any sense whatsoever. But there should be like, we need to stop being so hard on ourselves. We need to like have a bit of optimism. Like we've done like things as a country that are like really like impressive. Like we started the Industrial Revolution. We ended slavery with our Navy. Like, you know, we've obviously done like a lot of morally bad things too. Like, don't even get me started. But like, my point is like, which of those two things do you index on?
Yeah.
Do you index on the stuff where it's like, these are all the reasons we're bad and these are all the reasons we're going to fail? Or do you index on say like, these are the positive cards we've got for us. These are the positive hand we've been dealt. How do we play this hand as effectively as possible? As an individual, as a country, and how do we like kind of have this like mindset of like, we can be great. It's not going to be handed to us on a platter, but like that's almost like that optimism is by definition the starting point of anything. And so I think it's, you know, this has been a very meandering conversation and we haven't like knuckled down specifically, but like this is just a set of feelings I have about why I think we're so down on ourselves. You know, why these led to like negative outcomes.
I think it's good because it leads on to one of the things we can talk about regarding Gary's economics. And he, I think, is a good example of someone that will just, he claims to like not be, he claims to not be saying this, but he does come across as someone who is anti-entrepreneur, someone that's anti, like being self-made, because he talks so much about taxing wealthy people, but it's just not clicked. It doesn't seem to have clicked in his head that if you tax wealthy people, it's the same thing as not incentivizing someone to be entrepreneurial. It's the exact same thing.
To Steelman his case, let me try Steelman his case. There are a set of people who have either like inherited a lot of wealth, who have kind of had everything handed to them on a platter, and they just roll their assets forward, right? And they don't have to do anything like risky or creative with those assets. Just to like kind of over time grow those assets, if you see what I mean. Like, let's say third generation person, they've got a family office, which is a pooled investment vehicle where the family has like hires. You tend to have like 20 million net worth roughly to be able to do this. But you basically pay someone whose job it is to full-time invest your family's money in various different things. And so these kids are just like claiming the interest of the parents' money. They don't have to do anything like.
But I don't think that's what he's arguing against, because you can tax that. That is actually what's being taxed, right? Like when you invest, you pay capital gains. I think what he's arguing against are the people that avoid paying tax and they actually get loads.
Yeah, but those people will like be tax efficient. They will like optimize.
They all, but like he's not. I don't think he's. I mean, if you ask someone, look, do you want to do you want to do this with your money where you just avoid paying less tax and it's legal? Like you're obviously going to do it, right? Which is what these
guys
do.
How do you set up those set of like? Where do those incentives benefit you?
Well, I don't think he's talking about those people though, because, and if he is, then I think it's silly because they are actually paying tax, and those people probably pay like a lot of tax as well. I think he's talking about the people that have exactly what you talked about, that are in those situations where they have assets that are being handed down generation by generation, but they're using those assets as collateral to get money from the banks that they actually don't pay tax on, and they're using that money to basically live their lavish lifestyle. And I think that particular situation I completely agree with Gary against, because how do you tax that individual who isn't actually investing their assets into anything but purely using them as collateral to get money, free money essentially?
So yes, and I think when we stratify things, it's very hard for people to get like a broad conception of how people with 10 figures of wealth, 9 figures of wealth, 8 figures of wealth, 7 figures of wealth, 6 figures of wealth, and so on, up to 11 figures of wealth, probably, right? Tens to hundreds of billions. These are all very discrete categories, and the people living in these different categories are going to have very different experiences of tax systems, of life. And so let's break it down, right? If you have probably 100 plus million, let's say, you're going to be in a situation where you are geographically unrestrained. You can be whatever you need to be. Your money can be wherever it needs to be.
Yeah.
It can be in various like loopholes and strategies where your effective tax rate on that is going to be insanely low, right?
Okay.
The ire that I think, what I think is really frustrating is, let's say you have guys like an orthodontist who's really successful and he's worth 10 to 15 million.
Yeah.
Because he's like grafted hard his whole life.
Yeah.
He's set up his own little practice. He's doing braces. He's benefiting people like around him. A lot of the like frustration in society is actually, I think, poured on the orthodontist who's worth 10 to 15 million, which I'm not saying is, it's obviously an insane amount of money. Like, don't get me wrong. Like, my point is like, the orthodontist is like 1,000 orders of magnitude smaller than the guy with $100 billion.
Yeah.
However, the orthodontist lives in your town.
Yeah.
He's visible.
Yeah.
He's got a nice car. And the people who are in that town project that feeling of like frustration on the kind of orthodontist.
Yeah.
You see what I mean? And because he's the only visible one.
Yeah.
And he's the only one that like can feasibly be taxed highly, because he's not at the level of wealth where he can just be a ghost, you know, wherever he needs to be. The ultra wealthy also allow the ire of society to be directed on that guy because they're protected at the top. And so what I agree in a sense is like the most heavily taxed people now are the people who earn like 100K plus, right? Which in London is probably top, I think it's top 5% of earners, top 7% of earners, something like that. They're the ones who pay the most tax burden in society, because once you get up to a certain level of wealth, it doesn't apply to you anymore. You know what I mean? But then like, in a way, those people, like, what upsets me about those people is like, they don't feel any sense of responsibility to people in their country. If you know what I mean? It's like, I'm not saying that we should like take all their wealth. What I'm saying is like, it's immoral that there's like this like steep gradient up into the point where like, just like people who've like done pretty well for themselves at like the 10 million mark. Obviously, we're just talking in relative terms here. Pretty well at 10 million is obviously insanely well. Someone hasn't got any money. But to like somebody worth 100 billion, it's not even like on the bottom of that. It's not even a toenail on their shoe. You know what I mean? But these people are the people who get savaged the most. If you see what I mean. But actually, where a lot of the frustration in society really is like kind of the people who are causing the set of things that has led to the deindustrialization of the north of England are the people with 100 billion. Not the people with the 10 million orthodontist on your block. What I'm saying is that 10 million orthodontist is the one who's caught in this like savage trap where they get a lot of the hate from the bottom and they get a lot of the tax and they're not wealthy enough yet to be in that kind of loophole. But you see what I mean?
I see what you mean.
And I think this is like the immoral thing where it's like, actually, it should be the 100 billion people. You know what I mean? Who, because of whatever.
Well, maybe because of British culture as well. Like that's probably what, as well as what's making them want to be a ghost. I mean, I've thought about this. I was like, I have this idea of, imagine I was like insanely wealthy. What would I want to do? Well, sometimes I feel like if I had like all the money in the world, I would want to be a public figure and I'd want to invest in, you know, local enterprise and parks and housing and all that stuff. But then, do you really want to be a public personality with a lot of money in the UK? You're going to be have constant media attention. Constantly, someone's going to try and like is going to be waiting for you to slip up. And as soon as you do, it's like they're just going to come for you. You know, like a pack of lions. And so it's difficult being a wealthy person in the UK and having to sort of balance the sort of like
but that's part of the meritocracy, right? Like in a way, it's like.
But what I'm saying is like if when you're like in that billions level, like no one is going to respect you basically in the UK, like because people just don't respect people like that. Even if they were investing so much back into the UK, like they would be looked at with suspicion.
I actually just don't think that experiment has been run, because since the 90s, our like elite have, under the cover of this idealism of we're like people of the world, we like, you know, want to build up everyone, like pull people out of poverty, like we want to, you know, this and that, have hollowed out the industrial base of this country. And they've used this idealism of globalization as a cover for offshoring all the the steel, all this and that, which I think has been obviously just on a strategic level idiotic. Like if all the steel you use to build everything in society comes from another country, they've got your balls in a vice when you need to make a submarine or whatever. But it's basically been we've come through a massive point where I do think there are I'm not someone who thinks it's inherently wrong for people to make profits, but I do think that there's this Ben Franklin adage of doing well by doing good, where he's constantly trying to make money in a way that benefits his community,
which
and
is
society.
which is the only sustainable way of making money.
But that is the culture that our elites have lost in a way, where it's you're disentangling the doing well by doing good. You're just saying the doing well.
But this is the top thing about the UK is that our culture doesn't let people get rich by doing well, because as soon as they try and do well, they're immediately looked at with suspicion. They're just so suspect of anyone. I don't know. It's a part of the culture, right? I remember this story of you can be in a working class town and you're suddenly your dad buys a new car and you've got a flashy car in your front driveway. Everyone's like, oh, well, who's your dad over to get that type thing? It's just that immediate response. I don't know where it comes from.
Well,
I think
maybe the mentality of but again, it's the mentality of for you to have done well, you had to have exploited someone else,
exactly,
or taken it from someone else, not created, that. It's I love this point where it's just to illustrate wealth creation. It's let's say Apple is taking some raw aluminium, some raw lithium, some raw silicon that collectively costs raw materials wise $300, and they're turning it into a laptop that's worth $1,000. That's creation of wealth, right? So you're taking what's there, you're restructuring it, reordering it into a way where it's worth far more than the sum of its parts. And that is a micro example of the creation of wealth. You know what I mean? But there's also a mentality where it's any situation in which you're employing people, you're by definition exploiting them because they need money, and you're exploiting their need of money to get them to do something that benefits you. You make profits, right? That's kind of the argument in a way.
Yeah, I think one good solution to that is actually giving equity to your employees.
Yeah, absolutely. This is the thing that I think a Silicon Valley innovation that everyone should be doing. And we need to do this way more as a society.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Way more, and have maybe a tax benefit for if you're an employee of a company up to maybe £10,000, let's say, of equity, you don't have to pay any capital gains on disposing of that. And that encourages business owners, and maybe they get a tax break on the income tax they have to pay their employees to encourage business owners to do it too. Because you want everyone to be bought into the business. And the only way you get wealthy really is equity. That also teaches people about equity. It teaches people about, and I think there needs to be kind of a broad cultural practice of doing that, or more of an expectation of that. Which I think,
I mean, and maybe they should do that on a national level then, where everyone is given bonds when they're born. And those bonds is the equity that you have in the nation.
But part of the problem is we've had such short-termist political thinking, where the difference between the UK pension system and the Singaporean pension system is, in the UK, when you pay your national insurance, the way it works is they're just taking the money you're paying in now and giving it to an old person who is retired. Right? So it's a one-to-one thing. And the whole system is predicated, and this is a big collapse we've got coming for us now, is it's predicated on there's always being more young people than old people. There's more people to pay the bill of the older people than there are people claiming. But what we've got now is that it's this. A smaller and smaller amount of young people, a bigger and bigger amount of old people. And now potentially being asked to bear arms to keep and pay insane amounts of tax to keep them in a certain lifestyle. It's an insane thing to ask of a young population. That's why a lot of people are emigrating to Dubai or whatever, because they're no, I want to keep my money, basically. And the Singaporean model is saying, we're going to take the money you're paying in national insurance and we're going to invest it. And we're going to build this massive investment fund. The Singaporean country it's obviously a bit of land, but they've got these institutions like GIC, Temasek, and some others, and it's basically like one of the biggest investment funds in the world, and they're just constantly looking for things to invest in. Massive like funds, infrastructure projects, housing in their own country, and it's like you blur the line. Like, is your country like an asset manager, or is it like a country?
Yeah.
But it's always done on behalf of the citizens. Norway's done a fantastic job of this too with the Sovereign Wealth Fund, because they're conceptually at a country level, taking the long-term mindset, which is not something our government's done. Our government's always basically assumed a certain level of population growth.
Yeah.
We just take money from them and give it to them and just keep doing this over time.
Yeah.
We're not going to be able to benefit from that,
Yeah.
because the pyramid is collapsing, basically. The Ponzi scheme is over. If you think about it, the UK government is now already paying like 4% on trillions of debt. And if they had to pay more, if that interest rate went up, you'd very quickly get into a very bad debt spiral. That's part of the reason why Rachel Reeves is so risk averse with what she's doing, because she really doesn't want to do what Liz Truss did, which is to jump the interest rate that the government has to pay. Imagine you got a credit card, right? And all of a sudden, like, your business collapses, and you're like 20 grand in debt, and you're paying 4%. They hear about your business collapsing, like, now you have to pay 12.
Yeah, exactly.
And you're like, I'm already in a bad situation. Now I have to pay 3x compounding rate of debt. It's just not gonna work out. So, but that's part of the problem with the UK is that when the government issues debt, right? The government says, I wanna like borrow money to finance military spending. That money has to come from somewhere. You can't say, I'm going to issue debt and then just pull money out of the air. You kind of can with quantitative easing, where you print money, but that causes inflation. So it's not free, you know? Somebody has to buy that debt. Somebody has to say, okay, I'll take that bond and give you cash in exchange. And part of the way the government has made sure there's always someone to buy that debt is by saying to the pension funds, we're going to mandate that you are very risk adverse. So one of the only things that you can invest in is the debt that we issue. The downside of that is that, let's say you're a UK tech company, there's quite an abundance of like venture capital money in the UK, where you can, through some like really beneficial like kind of tax schemes, invest in early stage startups in the UK and get a tax break on the way back, right? That means there's a lot more availability of early stage capital for like small VC type businesses in the UK. But there's a progression, right? So the earliest stage of a private business is venture capital. That's the kind of financing you need to fund an idea, or like, you know, a website that like it's got a few like employees kind of starting to generate the revenue, not profitable yet. You need some cash to like invest in your business and like scale. Then you get to a point where you're like qualify what's called growth equity. Growth equity is when you go from like seed stage to series A, B, C, D. Past VC, we have almost no institutional kind of growth equity in the UK. So if you're a business in the UK, like a tech business or whatever kind of business, you have a cap on
support,
the business size that you can be before support becomes really hard to get. And then you have to pretty much turn to American growth equity firms.
So did they relocate to the US?
Well, not necessarily, but the point is the return on those gains is going to predominantly US investors. So growth is like, it's less risky than VC, but it's still risky because it's still like kind of a scaling business. It doesn't necessarily have to be profitable. It's called growth because you're not optimizing for profits, you're optimizing for growth. You know what I mean?
Exactly,
You don't necessarily have to be profitable at that stage to be reinvesting in a business model to scale it to the point where you can flick a switch. And
I know all about that. I worked at Uber.
Yeah, exactly. So Uber, right? So they're not like Amazon was the first example of this. Like they made a loss for like the first like 15, 20 years before they just flicked a switch like all of a sudden. They're like, okay, we've scaled enough now and now we're like ready. But part of the problem is then all the productivity gains, or a huge amount of productivity gains of that growth equity go to foreign investors, like, you know,
and of course
US
they don't pay tax on the profits.
And well, they have to pay, because of tax treaties, they have to pay tax in the US. As long as the taxes are equivalent to what the taxes would be in the UK. But the second point is because they're US and they're investing in dollars, that is what encourages a lot of our businesses to end up listing on the New York Stock Exchange instead of the London Stock Exchange, which is they want to. Even though you're a UK business, you can list on the Saudi Stock Exchange, Japanese, whatever. A lot of them end up listing in the US, which means that those gains benefit the S&P as opposed to the FTSE, you know? And so this is like, if we want to solve this dilemma of getting more entrepreneurship in the UK, getting more kind of like, firstly, we have to, as a society, say, we value entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
This is something we want more of. We want more people to take risks.
Yeah.
Secondly, we have to address what are the biggest things that make it difficult to be an entrepreneur,
Yeah.
to scale these hyperscale businesses.
Yeah.
Like Revolut's a great example. Think about how much value just that one business has brought to the UK, the amount of people we've employed, etc. So we have to basically say, okay, that's a valuable thing to do in the first place. Secondly, what are the blockers that make it hard to do that?
Mm-hmm.
Part of that is like the regulation system, which, as we've discussed, is set up by incumbents to make it really hard for competitors to spring up from the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
And also just basically in general makes it really hard to like basically start a business.
Also, probably the benefit schemes that we have as well.
In what way?
In that it's like, it makes people too comfortable in order to want to even start a business, because it's annoying, but the more wealth that gets redistributed to people that don't have wealth, the less incentive they're going to have to start something of their own.
Yeah. I mean, Matt, it's a bit radioactive, right? Because what percentage of those people are genuinely like people who could work but choose not to?
It's tough.
That's the political debate. Like, if you're really right, you're like, oh, all these people are freeloaders.
Yeah.
But then if you like take like a compassionate view, like there's probably a huge percentage of those people who are like unable to work.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't live in the kind of society where your whole like value to society is determined purely on economic grounds.
Yeah.
Like, you're not just your salary. You're not just like the economic value you contribute to society. You're a human being with like intrinsic worth, if you know what I mean. It's
Mm-hmm.
not just purely an economic unit of production.
Yeah.
And I think this is where it's a really tough one, because you can set up a benefit system which does remove the incentive to work.
Mm-hmm.
I honestly just don't know enough about our system to comment
Yeah.
whether or not that's the case. You have to assume some people, right? Probably. On the other hand, there's probably a huge amount of people who genuinely need that and genuinely like, you know. But I honestly just don't know enough about the.
Yeah.
But I see your point.
Because I think it's counterintuitive, because one solution you might have to enabling and empowering people to start more businesses is saying, look, the risks are less if you fail, basically.
Yeah.
That would be like an intuitive way of thinking about it. It's like, hey, you want more people to be more entrepreneurial, de-risk the
entrepreneurship.
Yeah, exactly, de-risk entrepreneurship. But actually, that's going to make people less entrepreneurial then, because they've got that safety net, and so
this is a baffling
which is
thing
interesting.
The baffling thing about the US to me is like part of the health insurance thing. The tying of health insurance to your job makes it way harder to take a risk on starting a business, because you have to lose your health insurance to do that. You see what I mean?
Okay.
Because let's say you start your business, and in the process of building up your business to the point where you can afford to cover yourself with your own business insurance policy, in that gap, you might get hit by a bus or whatever. Yeah. And then you're really fucked, basically. Anyways, I think one thing that we could do that would benefit the society is having a completely different cultural view on entrepreneurship, completely different view of like dynamism, like success as well. I think we've got a very positive relationship with success in the UK.
This is another topic which I remember we touched on. I don't know if it was recorded though, where I think we need to change how we view success. Yeah. I think we did talk about it actually. Yeah. But yeah, that success for person A could mean something completely different for success for person B. And I think
we did. Yeah.
And what I think we need to change in society is where there's a whole maybe there's a cul-de-sac, and there's different people that have different jobs, and there's a bunch of families that are doing really well for themselves, but suddenly like one family moves into the street who has a better car, they have better clothes, they maybe this guy's earning 10 times as much more money than the rest of the village. We need to be in a society where we're okay to have that person join us, and we don't sort of look at that person as competition and then start to get jealous of the things that they have, and you start to look inwards and think, oh, I'm not as successful as them, they're more successful than me, because you know what I mean? Because I think that sort of thinking has permeated our brains in society, where it's impossible to like not have that mindset of constant competition and constant growth, because that's the counter to what we're saying, because we want there to be as much growth as possible. We want there to be we want to live in a prospering society with new businesses, but there needs to be a stage where you're actually content with what you have and you feel fulfilled through the right things and not just fulfilled through money. Because I think a lot of people are confusing what we're saying with the point of a prospering society is for entrepreneurs to basically make as much money as possible. Because money is not the thing that we're solving
Yeah.
for here. It's something else. It's like fulfillment, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I think that's definitely a good place where we can sort of conclude is that the whole point of entrepreneurship, and I think you'd agree with me, is not so that you can make as much profit as possible. It's so that you're able to feel fulfilled as much as possible and be fulfilled by the giving back in society, or being fulfilled by what your business does to wider society. You're not solving for more profit, although profit is the measure of how successful your business is.
Yeah.
But the business should be how much are you able to optimize? Like, how much does it cost for you to give the most out of society?
Yeah. I think just to tie some of the threads we've had together, a business only works if it's solving a problem that is painful enough that you're willing to pay that business to solve that problem. Basically, every product is a physical instantiation of a solved problem.
Yeah.
You see what I mean? Whether that's a consultant, an iPod, whatever. It's like solving a problem. Sometimes not even problems you think you have.
Yeah.
But they're showing you a solution that is very like convenient and that you like, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where business goes wrong, in my opinion, is that they lose track of the pro-social requirements, I think, that you ought to have to be a business in a country.
Yeah.
Like, where is this sense of like, you owe the fellow people who live in your country something? You know what I mean?
I think you're talking about the difference between someone starting a business that's going to benefit wider society and is going to benefit the median individual versus someone, and this is what I'm picturing when you're talking about the wrong way to start a business, which is ticks all definitions of business. But it's someone who started a business as a financial advisor to the people that have net worth of billions, and their business is telling them how to reallocate their money so that they pay less tax in the UK. Because that ticks all the definitions of business. I'm sure they're getting a cut of every single pound that's leaving the UK.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's actually a net negative probably on wider society.
Yeah.
Even though they're making business, and maybe they're employing people, and maybe they're actually benefiting by the taxes they're paying to the UK, but it's not a sustainable business model. Yeah. In some way. But like just those two types of businesses is quite an interesting comparison because they're both doing what we're sort of advocating for. But one is the raw, there's a clear difference, I think, in the sort of business that we would invest in.
Yeah. One that can do well by doing good, basically.
Yeah.
Not one that's going to like just, businesses that just optimize for share price.
Exactly.
End up, like Boeing is a great example of this. They went from like being a business that like cared deeply about like building the best planes.
Yeah.
And then they brought in a CEO who just cared about share price.
Yeah.
Share price should be an oblique goal that is a consequence of you caring about building the best airplane, right? And when you overly financialize and you overly like index on, I'm going to take money that I would have spent on R&D to make our plane safer and not fall out of the sky.
Yeah.
I'm going to use that to buy back shares to reduce the supply of shares, therefore increasing the price. That's a good short-term goal if you care about the share price of Boeing, but it's a terrible long-term goal if you care about the health of the company.
Yeah.
Because then you have planes falling out of the sky and people shorting the stock and like the stock coming down. So my point is like just the mere profits, like profit should be a goal, but it should be an oblique goal.
Yeah.
It should be a goal that comes as a consequence of you serving some social function, solving some problem for people. And a business is not just like their profits. It's like the employment opportunity it gives people, the learning opportunities it gives people.
Yeah.
It's, and I think the only way that you could do that is there's no like kind of top-down regulatory way you can do that. You have to make people like give a shit about each other. Like, the culture of business has to be one that like is uplifting. Yeah. It's giving equity in your company to your employees. It's this, these kind of things.
Exactly. It's the difference between a restaurant that wants to grow by investing in better quality meat versus a restaurant that wants to grow by investing in cheaper meat, basically.
Yeah.
Because you can look at these two restaurants and think, well, the one that's investing in higher quality meat, they're going to pay more for their meat. So someone might look at that and think it's a bad business decision.
The unit economics of the meal
Exactly, is worse. But they have a long-term view. They know with better quality meat, they're going to get more customers. Maybe the customers are going to pay more per order. So they're going to grow in that aspect. But then the restaurants investing in the cheaper meat, they're thinking, look, unit economics per burger sold is going to be way better. But they're not thinking about it, you know, in the future. They're not thinking that over time, people are going to catch on to the fact that they're serving, you know, quality food.
Yeah.
And I think we live in a world where there's too much of restaurant B's.
Yeah.
And we need more people that want to start businesses like Restaurant A.
Yeah. I think that's a great place to finish.
Yeah.
So you're going to start a restaurant. Start Restaurant A.